Welcome to Chef Leadership Academy. This lecture is all about sustainability. As we all know, sustainability has become now in the core of everything in the world, both from the policymaker viewpoint, from the citizenship viewpoint, and of course the corporate viewpoint. I think it's very important to understand why the problems with the environment arose, and if you understand the root cause, then maybe we have a way to figure out how to solve the problem. The problem itself seems to be genuine. I had publications in the 80s in this area, wrote a major paper in the 90s, and I find that some new perspective is needed than we see typically in political debates, in Doha round of trade negotiations, and finger pointing that goes on. So let me start by having the title of this session itself as being unique, different. It's called Nurturing Nature, How to Reverse the Side Effects of Industrial Revolution or Industrialization in general. Here are some inconvenient truths, as one of our vice presidents always talked about, Al Gore. He was famous for the documentary and brought to the forefront, at least at the mass population level, public opinion issue by having a documentary called The Inconvenient Truth. Mine is a little more from the academic side, but here are the kinds of issues that have become the forefront of news as well as a daily dialogue among citizens. Global warming. Again, we don't want to talk about who to blame, that's a separate issue, but there is a phenomenon of global warming as indicated by the glaciers, especially in Greenland, Alaska, or any of the Arctic countries by and large. Acid precipitation has increased also over time, especially if you plot it over the last 50-60 years. Threats to ozone layer, and this was pointed out, I remember when I was at University of Illinois, carbofluorine was a very key ingredient that was used in freezing technologies, whether it's a freezer or a refrigerator, and they were abolished eventually because somebody was able to show that there is a very direct correlation, cause and effect, between the increase in that ingredient with the rise of the hole in the ozone layer, which protects us from radiation and all this stuff. We do have the accumulation of greenhouse gases, and this is now becoming like a carbon footprint that people talk about doing, even trading among companies who generate versus companies who don't generate and therefore get credit. We have the deserts more and more encroaching and consuming agricultural land. Again, this is a very clear chronological evidence that's shown. There's a fast depletion of vital natural resources, again at a rate of pace which we didn't expect in the past. There is a disappearance of rainforests, primarily in terms of urbanization or more habilitation by people away from where they live, which is, let's say, rural population to urban migration or expansion of the urban geographies. And last one, and a very critical one, is the loss of species or the biodiversity in general. All of this comes from a great article by William Chandler, wrote in 1990, and typical dilemma that we go through between economic development or human development in general and the environmental change consequently it creates. Here are some other numbers. Where does all of this environmental damage or potential damage arising from? And I found it very fascinating that most of that comes from unsuspected places. If you take global warming, and its indication, which is CO2, you take air pollution, you take water pollution. If you take the habitat alteration for land use, which means converting agricultural wildlife into something else, the biggest source is the household itself, which is, I think, very important to understand. Household operations generate 35% of all global warming, 32% of air pollution, 21% of water pollution, and about 4% of the land is used for household operations, encroachment into that land. Second one is food, which again is related to home consumption, and I will make a point at the end after showing the numbers. 12% of global warming is attributed to food production, the value chain. 17% of air pollution is attributed. 38% of water pollution is attributed, most likely in making the food, processing the food, etc. And of course, habitat alteration, it is actually 45%, which means we are taking land for more and more agricultural or mass production technologies. Transport is the third major source of all these environmental degradations. 32% of all of the global warming is attributed to transportation, and that includes from wherever the product is produced to wherever it is sent out, shipped, stored, etc., including also the personal transportation, which is automobile. So, it is not just the product transportation, it is personal transportation also. Air pollution, transport contributes 28%, water pollution is the least 7%, and the use for land for alternate reasons is about 15%. So, if I add up those columns, you can see these three sources create 79% of global warming, 77% of air pollution, 66% of water pollution, and 64% of the land used for other purposes or preservation, conservation to commercial or consumption utilization is 64%. I think very important message is that is the last mile of consumption where you have the biggest footprint of CO2 or global carbon footprint by and large. My view is that it happens at the consumption level, where we buy products at one time, store it for consumption in refrigerator, then the supermarket stores it someplace, keeps it for weeks or months depending upon the product category. That creates a footprint, and if you take the value chain back again, it all adds up pretty much. We says that maybe the solution lies some other place than where we have thought. But before I get into specific recommendations, I would suggest we find out why this happened. I mean, consumption always has been there. Household always consumed before industrial revolution and after industrial revolution. Most of the carbon footprint, which I will focus primarily, seems to have emerged much greater, and the greenhouse effect that we see has been rising primarily since we divorced production from consumption. So, the biggest consequence of industrial revolution in my mind is not economies of scale or modernization as we talk about, automation, etc., but is the separation of production from consumption. That separation seems to have created more environmental degradation than anything else. Therefore, it suggests that if one can put the production and consumption together back again at the same time and the place, maybe one should be able to reverse or not add to the current environmental degradation. Second thing, in my analysis, I find that in industrial revolution age and in industrialization process, we made an assumption that nature is passive and almost inorganic, because we extracted industrial raw materials which takes thousands if not millions of years for nature to produce, whether that's copper, iron, coal, anything that we use in the industrial production and consumption processes. I think that's a very key belief system that is very important for us to see how much side effect that belief system has created, that nature is inorganic, even though we all know it is organic. Everything in nature is organic. Also, through automation and mass production, we simply expanded the capacity. We made things more affordable, more accessible over time, and in the process we probably encouraged or enhanced consumption. Last thing is very important. We assume that man-made is better, faster and cheaper than nature, and of course technology has benefited us. Think about the days before the rise of the allopathic pharmaceutical industry, medicine. We used to have primarily vegetation or animal based medical practices which came for hundreds of years if not thousands of years from sort of a tradition of word of mouth, one generation telling the other generation, as it is still prevalent in many of the less industrialized societies where you have a local the medicine man, as it is called, or a medicine chief. The chief of a village understands the medical aspects, for example, and is like a medical doctor. Or in many of the emerging economies, like in Chinese economy or the Indian economy, you have very traditional people who come out with a compound, a mixture out of the traditional home remedies, or out of herbs and all those kinds of what we call alternate medicine. We made more vitamins in factory than nature could ever produce. We made more insulin than nature could ever produce, etc. While we did all that right, and the humanity has become a lot more livable, it is not as harsh as, for example, the living in the hunter-gatherer age. It is not harsh as living in the primitive agricultural societies. I mean, we have a very comfortable life. This videotaping that I am doing in a professional studio, I could not have imagined without having the advancement of technology. So I can all understand, we can all appreciate, but I think what we have to appreciate equally is that all of these have had long-term side effects, and we have never understood or recognized the long-term cumulative effects of everything. As we are recognizing now that when you have a potent drug for any therapy, it has side effects, and cumulatively when the side effects become as big or bigger than the main effects, we have to question whether the technology is good for the mankind, or is it actually a double-edged sword. So while technology has benefited society, we must also focus on the side effects of technology. So my view is that, well, can we go back to nature? And therefore, can we understand the way we did business before the Industrial Revolution? We always had production and consumption. Is it possible to do the same thing in a more modern contemporary society using modern principles of production, supply chain, consumption, etc.? We teach about branding and marketing and all this stuff, but maybe can we do it in the older setting, which means the same theory or concepts are now embedded into contemporary life and contemporary thinking by and large. So here are the things that we all know, our ancestors, older generations always talked about. First, nature is biological. We have to basically have that as a very conscious thinking. It is a living, breathing and regenerative entity, every species, whether it's a sea world, whether it's earth or even in the air. And there is a complex ecosystem with self-governance. People believe this sounds so different than faith-based thinking or something, but remember, a market, which is what I study quite often, is considered an ecosystem. Market behaves invisibly on its own. It has all kinds of iterative processes, interactions. It adjusts itself properly in a very complex ecosystem. Same thing around here, that nature was organized by whoever did it is in a self-governance manner. And of course, we all have understood that, till maybe Darwin's thinking that came in to say that there is some sort of a hierarchy of species. And I think that concept we need to give back to say that all elements of the nature are equally important in the ecosystem. There is no some such thing as an inferior or a superior, or something that is a weaker or a stronger. If we have that thinking, then we will invert a horizontal structure into a vertical structure. Working with nature is a better sustainable model than exploiting it. Again, it's the same problem. It's our mindset. It's the mindset of the scientist and the industrialist and the governments. There was no need to exploit nature. If we nurture nature, it can sustain ourselves indefinitely. Whereas if one exploits, extracts a lot faster, sooner, in a more damaging way than what nature can produce, then by definition we will deplete the resources and create all of the environmental side effects in the process. So working with nature is a better sustainable model than exploiting it, which is what the traditional societies always thought about anywhere in the world. Like all living biological organisms, nature is capable of passive resistance if abused. We have seen this thing, for example, in the animal world. Animals that people have grown with for livelihood purposes, whether it's chicken, pig, whatever it is, if you treat them with surprisingly positive emotions, love, affection, the animal produces more, gives you back more. And of course, all farmers love their livestock. We are now doing all kinds of scientific experiments that if you pump music into a typical, in fact, coop of eggs laying hen chickens, for example, they produce better. So what else is new? All living beings have the capability, as humans have. There doesn't seem to be any difference. So if we can do that right, just like humans, if you exploit them, they will stop cooperating. You cannot get things out of others through force. It has to come naturally from them, and the role of the taker is to nurture, nourish, and encourage them to give you more. As is to happen, still happens in traditional societies, that if you nurture your children right, they will take care of you in the older age. That's the thinking by and large. It is shown clearly in the world of cows that I know, very interestingly, that if you nurture the cow positively, etc., if you feed them properly, take care of them, they produce more milk, better calf, just goes on and on, the typical thinking. I think these are the kinds of tenets that we need to think back. Why nurture nature? As I said, the reason is assure sustainable growth. Clearly, one main reason why we need to have nurturing nature, what I call going back to the past, which is interesting. Reverse the side effects of industrialization. To me, the biggest consequence is not industrial revolution, but the side effects. And how do we therefore minimize that, or how do we control that? Again, we can learn from the old ways of doing things. Surprisingly better returns on investment. if an agricultural land is properly soiled, properly sort of put the nutrients back again somehow, it produces pretty indefinitely. But if one exploits the land and does overcropping or makes more crops, more excessive use, then the land depletes its nutrients, is not able to regenerate its own, and therefore does not do very well. And of course, this will enhance healthy living. So nurturing nature is not just a nice thing to do, it is becoming a necessity. And I think the sense of urgency finally has come in the society across the world. I travel all over the world. I meet people who are policymakers, government advisors, industrialists in emerging economies or advanced countries, and I do believe that environment is finally teaching us that it will be the biggest showstopper from further modernization, further growth, better living of human beings, and it will not be the capital or even technology. So how do you nurture nature, which is the main purpose of this lecture? So we have to have a nurturing production. We have to have a nurturing policy, and we have to have a nurturing consumption, the tripod of what one can do. So when I say nurturing production, are we doing production with consciousness about environmental damage that the production will create, and therefore how do we prevent that or avoid that altogether? Nurturing policy means that the public policy is organized to encourage, in fact, behaving, consuming, etc. in the way that is appropriate. And nurturing consumption basically means the same thing. That's much more the consciousness. So the one can even put the label of consciousness around here, and it will mean the same thing. Doing production, policy, and consumption from this consciousness of sustainability, and I'm talking about environmental sustainability, not economic sustainability. So let's take the first one about production. What can we do? The biggest thing that one can do is to somehow, if the man could intervene through industrial revolution in the nature's ecosystem to create the side effects, man can intervene again to do the more positive effects, which is man through intervention or human species through intervention can actually increase the biodiversity. And first time I really learned about the consequences of reducing biodiversity was my study in the 70s, something in the consumerism area, and I learned that over time, for the sake of economies of scale and standardization of production to create economies of scale, in the US alone we had reduced from 2,500 species of corn to down to about maybe 20 species of corn, which increases yield per acreage. We understand that thing. Makes, for example, grading and sorting and assorting easier. Probably downstreaming value added processing and production that we make, such as making cereals or as a cow feed for the animals, whatever we do out of corn, all that easy. Making corn syrup probably is easier, that goes ultimately into beverages. Just think about all the uses of corn that the humankind makes ultimately for ultimate consumption, directly or indirectly. But it made the whole corn species susceptible with a mass disease called the blight, which happened in this country in the 50s, for example. Therefore, increasing biodiversity itself is a major sustainability initiative, and it can be done with the same economies of scale and same profit objectives rather than make a trade-off between profit objectives and biodiversity. I mean, we do that in some of the wildlife protection, where we try to enhance the fish population, for example. We try to enhance a lot of wildlife kinds of things that we know, bird sanctuaries, etc. You can just imagine. So I think increasing biodiversity is the first major initiative for what I would call nurturing production. Localized production, I think, which is the biggest probably initiative that can come about. Today we know through lean operations of TQM, total quality management, just in time, cycle time, mass customization, that I can have economies of scale of producing only a few units with the same cost structure as producing infinite units. This we did not know with the first generation of our knowledge of industrial age economics. Today we know that, which means that who says we have to produce a large factory which obviously has excess capacity, local market cannot absorb all that capacity through demand, it has to be therefore stored. In order to store, we have to do all of the preservatives and additives to store it. It has to be then shipped out to places where there is a demand, and those places is the one where there is somebody who stores it again, consumes it. Just think about the typical from demand or from production, or let us say a farm to the table, and how many intermediaries are involved and how much holding time takes place, and just do the carbon footprinting on that alone, which probably is not necessary if we can now have localized production, localized consumption, like the bakeries used to do in the old days, like the milkmen did in the old days, but we do it in a more modern, contemporary way where we have branded packaged goods. I think this is a very interesting initiative. Hundreds of communities now have community farms. Even cities like New York City, not in the ground floor but up in the sky someplace, they are growing fruits and vegetables. They are growing daily supplies. There are restaurants now who have local farmers supplying. There are companies like Whole Foods who are encouraging local sourcing. All of that is possible. I know a project that I am involved on the NGO side, non-profit side, where we are finding that in the city of Atlanta, the lettuce we get comes from California. It has 2,500 miles of carbon footprint. Is it possible for us to grow lettuce locally in enough quantity, and can we have a local buyers? And the answer is yes. Nobody thought about it. Cleveland has already done it, primarily in the inner city, to even provide employment and job to people who are disadvantaged otherwise in the society. And they are doing the same thing in Atlanta using hydroponic technology. Millions of pounds of lettuce will be grown, and already most of the hospital groups have agreed to buy when they serve meals to patients, for example, and a couple of supermarkets have agreed to buy. So demand is not a problem. Price points does not seem to be a problem. It's a matter of just making a commitment and organizing, and I think this is a massive change taking place, and hopefully will happen on a worldwide basis rather than only in some advanced countries. The third way to nurture production is to shift to as many renewable resources so that we have a balanced way of taking out from the nature at a reasonable rate as opposed to excessive rates. Counterbalance with something that will replace, take a share away from what we need from nature that it cannot reproduce. So alternate energy is a good example where is it possible to get usable energy out of, let's say, solar technology or the sun. Is it possible therefore to do the same thing with windmills? There are many other aspects of nature that can be harnessed with a huge ecosystem without as many side effects, etc. So alternate energy comes out, biomass comes out, recycling comes out. There are so many ways to create renewable resources. That's all on the production side. Next major area is policy. Can we have a nurturing policy toward the environmentally conscious policy? And one of the first things is that policymakers can easily allocate resources to educate the masses to increase awareness in primary and secondary education, We do teach democracy, we do teach governments, we do teach history, we teach the traditional 3 R's of learning: reading, writing and arithmetic. We nowadays get them into community activities. Even in primary school I have seen quite a few places, but we do not provide the formal education about the environment. How can we do that? And it is very possible, because most educational institutions in primary and secondary are government funded and sometimes even government managed operations. Education is still a government institution as opposed to non-government institution. And of course, now we have the internet, and I am absolutely blown away and impressed how much information I can today have, or if I want to reach someone either for advice or for some conversation, I can find that person through any kind of a search engine, as if I have there is no need like a 6 degrees of separation used to be talk about. Formally they have found it is no more than 3, but I think it is becoming like 1 degree of separation essentially, even with strangers. So much of database is collected and stored and archived and organized that it is very easy for me to know quite a lot. Is it possible to encourage all this to be used properly in a more systematic, formal way is one of the recommendations. Policymakers can also offer economic incentives and disincentives. Generally, my observation is that disincentives work very well for production, supply side, and incentives generally work very well for consumption. And we have done that thing for making energy efficient heating, cooling, for example, or energy efficient appliances or energy efficient automobiles. We provide not only information but incentives for consumers to buy, which will actually give them some tax relief, whatever it is. And on the production side, we often demand heavy penalties for violation of any laws. And a third one, as what government and policy makers can make, is to have mandatory rules and regulations. We have done that to create smoke-free environment every place, to reduce the impact of smoking on the society. What we do in terms of personal harm, we can do the same kind of ways of thinking about the environmental or the harm to the planet as a whole. Child safety laws we passed, especially seat belt laws, safety seats laws, everything we have done to protect the child across many product categories, not just transport into the automobile, for example. So governments have been able to, through mandatory rules and regulations, steer the economic behavior of people both on the consumption side and on the production side. So if education doesn't work, is not enough, if economic incentives and incentives are not enough, then ultimately you have to have mandatory laws and rules and regulations, as we have done with the seat belts, as we have done with the airbags, just goes on and on. So it's very doable. The third area is, and it's the ultimate battleground or the last mile problem as everybody calls, is how do we encourage conscious consumption or mindful consumption, a consumption where the consumers basically are having self-awareness to make sure that they don't damage the environment in the process of consumption. And maybe they demand from others who are their suppliers to provide them products and services which will be less harmful. Again, I must tell you, I'm quite impressed how positive the public at large and the consumers in general have become very conscious about role they are playing and how much power, market power they can have, and maybe it is a much more powerful power than a citizenship power, etc. Economic power, market power seems to be very much in place. So here are 3 recommendations. One is enhance self-awareness, self-learning. We start in primary, secondary school, but eventually actually family has to socialize the idea with their children. have them go to the places where information is available about these phenomena, about the environmental issues. So, Google search engines, web-based learning is now very real, it is very possible. And of course, the Wikipedia has been a great resource, where any information I want, even more scientific, technical, I can have it at my fingertips, as it is called. How do we practice mindful consumption? I just wrote an academic paper in this area that mindful consumption is a very key construct. People will do it because they are not going out of their way to harm the environment. I don't think there are human beings brought into the world with the whole genetic intent to say, I want to harm others. I want to harm animals. I want to harm other human beings. I want to harm nature. We are born with the attitude of coexistence and maybe even nurturing. Where do we change then? How do we leverage that innate belief system, as well as maybe even a genetic predisposition, in terms of something that can be a consumption behavior which is less harmful to the environment? So, obviously, the 3 R's that have been heavily promoted, which is reduce consumption, second one is recycle, third one is reuse rather than throw away. I think those are the standard platforms. But encouraging shared consumption is another activity. For example, in mass transit, we have a shared rides pretty much. So, you have a group transit, mass transit. I did lots of experiments along with General Motors on van pooling, carpooling. In fact, carpooling is the studies that we did which led to van pooling as the concept, for example. And all of that is very possible that each one consuming independent of the others probably creates a duplicative impact on the environment to a level that we have not understood the consequences. So, individually I contribute so little, so I do not see the sense of my contribution, but collectively we create an enormous negative impact on the environment and the society. And of course, the last one is how do we consciously discourage waste. Now, again I am quite optimistic, and the reason is that I have seen lots of people engaging themselves in these kinds of activities. Can we make this into a movement of some sort, which is the last point I am making? I think all of this will accelerate in its thinking and etc. with the use of social media. To me, social media is a paradigm shifter. I mean, it is in the same league as the invention of the railroads, invention of the telephone, invention of the television, of course the internet. But I think social media is another major platform that can encourage through peer-to-peer counseling, influencing, etc., to create a nurturing consumption, a belief system, a culture in the society on a global basis. I think this can transcend cultural differences. This will transcend faith differences. It will probably transcend gender differences, age differences. That much universality I see in this particular phenomenon. So, you have the typical Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., social media. One can even organize a volunteer movement. This is becoming more and more popular, especially at the local community level. And the last one is that, is it possible to create out of environment as a common cause with which one rallies behind that, as we rally behind eliminating dreaded diseases like cancer, especially breast cancer, or as we rally behind eradicating poverty, as we rallied behind as a nation towards civil rights, for example. It became a national movement. I think it's very possible to make environment as a national, if not a global movement. Nurturing nature, let me conclude, will become a necessity to achieve sustainable growth. Rise of the new middle class in emerging economies, especially with billion plus Indian population, billion plus Chinese population, close to 950 million African population. You add additional about billion from the rest of the world who are all emerging economy, transition economies, agriculture to industrial, certainly would like to be modern consumers. It's just not tenable. The consumption is so massive a scale compared to when we began industrialization 150 years ago, or with the rise of America in late 1800s from the agriculture to the industrial society. The population base was so small, you could still play with the environment and you will not see the consequences quite some time, but now you see the consequences within a year, 5 years, 10 years definitely, as we have seen in all the big cities, for example, especially in emerging economies. So rise of the new middle class in emerging economies will put enormous pressures on world's natural resources. I don't think it's sustainable, and therefore sustainability is not an evolutionary process, but it is something that one has to intervene, just like we do with the health. You let it go and you're going to have chronic diseases, but if you have a preventative care, you prolong or you avoid altogether any chronic diseases. There is enough scientific evidence that the side effects of industrialization, such as global warming, are equally important to understand and therefore reverse in the process. Nurturing nature generates positive returns to business, consumers, and society at large. And I'll make a comment here which I know you will probably smile if not laugh, but I have done an economic analysis of return of investment on a cow. By the way, that return is better than any factory return. Same accounting, finance discipline. And the scale is very small. I get the same return on one cow from the cow producing milk for me, cow producing the calf, from birth to death, cow's life, how much can give me a return. And I find that I can do the unit of analysis at each individual cow, which is very micro level, and aggregate to a level, which means economies of scale is at the individual small micro level. Of course, we have done the similar analysis where a buffalo, a water buffalo, becomes a livelihood in villages like in Bangladesh. So if you have a village illiterate woman own a buffalo, finance her to buy a buffalo, it becomes a livelihood. We have already seen the economic impact. So the return on a buffalo or on a cow from an economic production is already done, but I'm talking about even just for personal consumption. It's incredible. It is probably better return than anything I've seen, except we never think from that viewpoint. So my view is that I think environmental sustainability is actually good business. It is good business for the business, it is good business for the society, and it is good business in fact for consumers themselves. Thank you very much.